All right, today we're going to start section 2, which details specifically what the war was like at home and how it affected society. By the time we're all said and done with this is going to take us 2 days. It's going to be two separate videos, one today, one tomorrow. You get your homework on Friday for this. So your only objective today is to finish your notes on YouTube. This is going to be pretty lengthy. You guys know that. But at the same time, I also know that you guys understand that slowing down to this speed really helps you guys a lot. So by the time we're done, though, we're going to take a look at the discontent with the war, how people felt in both the North and the South. We're going to take a look at what we call conscription, and which is basically drafting laws and how people got upset over that. We'll take a look at the economic effects of the war and the resistance by enslaved Americans. And then we'll finish off tomorrow talking about how women aided the war effort, and we'll also evaluate the conditions in both the northern and the southern prison camps. So, like it says right here today, our main objective, we will explain how the Civil War affected civilians. So, here are some of your vocabulary terms today. A copperhead, we'll talk about a little bit later, is a northerner who wanted peace with the Confederacy instead of victory in the war. A civilian is a term we still use today. Basically, this is anyone who is not in the military. Conscription, which I already mentioned a little bit, is forced service in the military. A bounty is a cash bonus that you get paid for enlisting in the service. Inflation is the increase in prices due to a decrease in the value of money. An income tax is a tax on earnings. And a greenback is paper money that was printed by the Union during the Civil War. So, I want you to think about, even if you have to pause, I want you to think about what are we going to do today? What is our main idea? What is a civilian? What happens to prices during a period of inflation? And what is an income tax? Now, answer to that is an income tax is a tax on earnings that was first adopted during the Civil War. A greenback looks just like this, and it was a form of paper currency issued by the federal government during the Civil War. Here's some things we already know. Do not write this down. We talked about it especially when we watched Crash Course yesterday, how John Green said that there were a lot of people that were not very happy with how Lincoln was doing things during the war. This war took way longer than what people anticipated, and people's opinions remained divided in the North, where there were a lot of people that did disapprove of Lincoln in the war, and he actually came very close to losing his next presidential election. We also know the Northern economy was much more industrialized than the Confederacy's economy. And we also know that most of the fighting of the Civil War and the worst of the destruction was going to occur on Southern soil. Now, I want to read you one American story real quick, straight out of the book. It says, as the Civil War moved into its third year, the constant demand for men and resources began to take its toll back home. Sometimes the hardships endured by civilians resulted in angry scenes like that witnessed by Agnes, a resident of Richmond, Virginia. On April 3, 1863, Agnes went for her morning walk and soon came upon a group of hungry women and children who had gathered in front of the Capitol. She described the scene as these women and children were joined by other people who were upset by the shortage of food. Here's what she says. The crowd now rapidly increased and numbered, I am sure, more than 1,000 women and children. It grew and grew until it reached the dignity of a mob, a bread riot. The mob then went out of control and it broke into shops and stole food, clothing, and other goods, and only the arrival of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the threat of force ended the riot. So in section 2 today, we're going to take a look at more of the hardships that the Civil War caused on the home front. These hardships did cause a lot of changes in civilian society in both the North and the South. So in the spring of 1863, riots like the one in Richmond broke out in a number of southern towns. Southerners were growing weary of the war and the constant sacrifices it demanded. Food riots, like we said, broke out in several southern cities, including Richmond, which was the capital city, and Confederate soldiers began to desert the army and left in increasing numbers. By the end of the year, the Confederate Army had lost nearly 40% of its men. Some of these men were on leave, but many others were deserters. Faced with the difficulties of waging war, the Confederate States fell into some disagreement. Southerners like Jefferson Davis believed the Constitution upheld the individual sovereignty or freedom and independence of states over that of any central government. This is where the Confederate idea of government is going to kind of bite them in the backside. So like I said, the Confederate States often fell into disagreement. The principle of states' rights that actually led them to break with the Union kept them from really coordinating their war effort at all. As one Southern governor put it, I am still a rebel, no matter who may be in power. So disagreements over the conduct of the war also arose in the North. Lincoln's main opponents were guys named Copperheads. They were Northern Democrats who favored peace with the South. Now, actually, in real life, a copperhead is a type of snake. It's very poisonous. It strikes without warning, so that's how Lincoln felt about these men. He thought they struck without warning. Now, President Lincoln actually had his protesters arrested. He also suspended something called the writ of habeas corpus, which prevents the government from holding citizens without a trial. All I've got to say to you guys is if someone did this nowadays, if President Obama tried this, people would go absolutely crazy. So, question. What did Southerners like Jefferson Davis believe the Constitution said about the rights of states? There are your choices. Go ahead and pause. Number 8. How did the South's principle of states' rights undermine the Confederate war effort? Here are your multiples. Go ahead and pause. What is a copperhead? There may be multiple correct answers here, so go ahead and pause. And finally, how did President Lincoln deal with copperheads and war protests? Go ahead and pause. Now, as the war dragged on, both the North and the South needed more soldiers. So as a result, both sides passed laws of conscription, also known as the draft. These laws required men to serve in the military. The Confederates had been drafting soldiers since the spring of 1862, and by 1863, all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to join the Army. However, there were a number of exceptions. Planters in the South who owned 20 more slaves could avoid military service. In addition, wealthy men could hire substitutes to serve in their place. By 1863, substitutes might cost as much as $6,000. The fact that wealthy men could avoid service caused poor Southerners to complain that it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Here you can see some poor men in the background with a rich man in front of them with his a general, and they're not happy about the fact that they're forced into fighting. The Union draft law was passed in March of 1863, and just like the Confederacy, the Union allowed draftees to hire substitutes as well. However, the North also offered $300 bounties, or cash payments, to men who volunteered to serve. So as a result, only a small percentage of men in the North were drafted. Most men volunteered and received the bounty. Now, even though the draft was extremely unpopular here, in July of 1863, anger over the draft and simmering racial tensions led to the New York City draft riots. For 4 days, rioters destroyed property and attacked people on the streets. Over 100 people were killed, many of them African Americans. So, what is conscription? It's a law that requires men to serve in the military, which, by all reality, we still do this today. All you boys, when you turn 18, you're going to have to fill out a card with the selective service, and if you ever want to do things like get a loan or get any help from the federal government or go to school and get school loans, you need to do this, otherwise you won't be able to do it. What is a bounty? It's a cash payment given by a government to volunteers who enlisted. And how do the draft laws in the North and South differ? Here are your options. Go ahead and pause. Some of the economic effects of the war. Many people suffered economic hardship during the war. The suffering was very severe in the South, where most of these battles were fought, but the North also experienced difficulties. Food shortages were very common in the South, partly because so many farmers were fighting in the Confederate Army. Even more, food sometimes couldn't get to market because trains are now being used to carry war materials. The Confederate Army also seized food and other supplies for their own needs. Another problem, especially in the South, was inflation. An increase in price, which is a decrease in the value of money. The average family food bill in the South increased from $6.65 a month in 1861 to $68 by middle of 1863. Over the course of the war, prices rose 9,000% in the South. Inflation in the North was much lower, but prices still rose faster than wages, which made life harder for working people. Some people took advantage of wartime demand and sold goods for higher prices. Now, overall, though, war production boosted northern industry and fueled the economy. In the short term, this gave the North a huge economic advantage over the South, and in the long term, industry would begin to replace farming as the basis for our national economy. I got a little ahead, so go ahead and pause this one. Now, during the war, the federal government also passed two very important economic measures. In 1861, it established the first income tax, which is a tax on earnings, which we still have today. The following year, the government issued a new paper currency known as greenbacks because of their color. The new currency helped the northern economy by ensuring that people had money to spend, so they could go out and buy whatever they needed. And after people would buy things, the stores then had money to either pay their workers, or if they owned their own shops, then they could go out and spend. And as long as everyone kept stimulating the economy would keep moving and functioning at a good rate. Now, the income tax also helped the Union pay for the war because, as we all know, war is very expensive. There were some Southerners in the border states that did take advantage of the stronger Union Army by selling cotton to Northern traders, which was in violation of Confederate law. Yankee gold, wrote one Confederate officer, is fast accomplishing what Yankee arms could never achieve, the subjugation of our people. So why did the South experience food shortages? Here are your options. Go ahead and choose one. And how did the war affect the economy in the North and in the South? There are your options. Finally, another factor that affected the South was the growing resistance from slaves. To hurt the Southern economy, slaves would slow their pace of work or actually stop working altogether. Some even carried out sabotage, destroying crops and farm equipment to specifically hurt the plantation economy. And there you can see them sitting around right there not doing a whole lot of work. And no one can really blame them. Now, a lot of times when planters fled advancing Union armies, slaves often refused to go along. They would stay behind waiting for Union soldiers to free them. Some enslaved people even started to rise up in rebellion against their overseers. More commonly, though, slaves ran away from plantations to join the Union forces as they pushed farther into Confederate territory. One Union officer described a common sight, and he said, "It was very touching to see the vast numbers of colored people following us after with babies in their arms, and little ones like our Anna clinging to their tattered skirts. One poor creature, while nobody was looking, hid two boys, 5 years old both, in a wagon, intending, I suppose, that they should see the land of freedom if she couldn't." Now, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the number of slaves fleeing southern plantations greatly increased. That was also kind of his intention. By the end of the war, as many as 500,000 slaves had fled to Union lines. So he definitely was correct when he thought it would weaken the South. So last questions here. Why did slave resistance grow as the war progressed? There are your options. And what was the least common form of slave resistance? All right, and that does conclude 17.2. Like I said, we will go over the rest of this tomorrow, so hopefully you're able to get all this finished. Have a good day, and I'll see you back on footnotes, your emails tomorrow on Friday.